So on Sunday, I used this phrase, the aspirational absurdity of grace. And I don't actually know where that phrase came from. A couple of people asked me. I'm going to assume it came from Robert Farrar Capon because it sounds like the kind of thing he would say, although I couldn't find the page reference, but let's just assume I lifted it from him. Regardless, though, it's a phrase that I absolutely love because it really captures something for me of the image of grace that Jesus invites us into through these stories and parables he uses. First of all, this idea that grace is absurd, that there's a certain economic that kind of rules our view of the world, that helps us decide what is sensible, what's rational, and how we should make decisions. But grace is something that not only transcends, it completely shatters that economic. It shows us that God is always willing to go above and beyond, be more generous than makes sense to welcome us back home, that God would leave 99 out in the open country just to go and track down one of us, even though it doesn't make sense. That's the beautiful thing about grace, is that it loves so extravagantly. But also, there's this idea that it's aspirational. That when we see these stories and when we let them touch our heart, we actually want to live in that kind of world. We want to become the kind of people who would live that way and live out of a story that doesn't make sense. We want love to be less than rational. We want it to be more than economic. We want it to be extravagant and gracious all the time. And it pulls us towards that kind of life. And this is something that I think is really core to the Christian story, that we are being called to be more than we can even make sense of right now. I read an article this week and I posted it online. It said that the US government has spent now $6 trillion and it has led to the death of 500,000 people in the war on terror since 9/11. And I posed the question, I said, what if we spent $6 trillion loving our enemies instead of fighting them? Would we live in a safer world? And immediately people jumped in to say, no, that's crazy. You can't do that. You need armies. You need wars. You have to aggressively defend the peace. And I'm not going to try to pretend that that's an easy answer. The world is incredibly complex and the people who lead us have very difficult choices to make. But I do think that as Christians, we have a compelling story to live out of that tells us that we're never going to know what the world will be like until we actually follow the way of Jesus. Being a Christian is not simply taking the word Christ and using it as an adjective. It's actually about living the way of Jesus, the way that is absurd, the way that is aspirational, the way that is generous and gracious even to our enemies all the time, that loves without requirement, that goes the extra mile, that leaves 99 to find the one. And I think part of being a Christian is actually believing that if we could find the courage to live the way that Jesus invites us to, that the world actually would be transformed, and that the kingdom of God would be something that we really can't even make sense of now because we're so conditioned by the world that's around us. Jesus lives in complete connection with the divine, and he lives out of that story in a way that we can only aspire to. But in each small step, when we do that, when we are generous with each other, when we're gracious with each other, when we go the extra mile and we love without anything in return, we begin to build a story that creates this kingdom that Jesus points us to. And this is so core and fundamental for what it means to be Christian, that we live in a way that is absurd to those around us, that we love in ways that don't make sense, and we aspire to a world that is so much better than we can even wrap our heads around right now. And my hope is that through this Lenten season, as we move to Easter, these stories of grace are really going to help us aspire to a life that we really can't make sense of yet.